The crowd is representative of death and despair and the sadness and the unhappiness that life so often brings. And Jesus looks at this woman and he is moved with compassion. And there is something about Jesus that is characterized by these statements. He was moved with compassion, or he had compassion upon her. If you want to know what God is like, you look at the life of Jesus. If you want to know what God is like in relationship to the burdens of life and the struggles of life, and if you saw the first session, when you want to know what God feels like when he looks at you and I, if we have spiritual leprosy and our lives are withered like that man with the withered hand, we look at the life of Jesus and we see the kind of compassion that he had for people in that situation. And we say that Jesus here and now is exactly the same. That when Jesus encounters tragedy and sadness, he is moved with compassion. And as he stands there next to this woman, Jesus reaches out and he touches the side of the coffin and he speaks to the dead man. And he says to him, "Arise." And miraculously, supernaturally, spiritually, physically, beyond our comprehension, this young man is raised from the dead. And then it says he was delivered to, he was given, he was shown back to his mother, who was then filled with a sense of relief and awe. And you can imagine that now all of the crowd, I guess the professional mourners went home, but all of the crowd now became a rejoicing crowd as they start traveling with Jesus on to the next place, to the next area of his destination. And we read again of where he goes to soon afterwards in chapter 13 of Luke's Gospel. On one of the Sabbaths, he was teaching in one of their synagogues. So we're going back now to the synagogue. In the audience or the congregation was a woman who for 18 years had suffered because of an evil spirit, and she was bent over and could not lift herself up straight. Jesus noticed her. He was always noticing people. And he spoke to her saying, "Woman, you are now rid of your infirmity." And then he put his hands on her and she immediately stood up straight and gave praise to God. I started to praise God. I would think so too. But the synagogue ruler, here comes the religious guys again, the synagogue ruler became very angry because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath. And he turned to the congregation and said, "There are 6 days in which to work. If you want to be healed, come on one of those days and not on the Sabbath days." And then this is one of these encounters where we see some of the emotions of Jesus rising, where he would get very angry when he encountered religious hypocrisy. And he says, "You hypocrites," said the Lord in reply, "do you not, every one of you, loose your ox or your donkey and lead them to water on the Sabbath? Don't you give water to your animals on the Sabbath? But this woman, a daughter of Abraham, who has been in the bondage of Satan," think of it, "for 18 years, should not have the right to be released from her bonds because it is the Sabbath." At these remarks, all those who had taken sides against him were ashamed of themselves. In fact, the whole crowd rejoiced at the wonderful things that he was doing. Now this story, excuse me, is interesting in as much as there's a lot here that we don't understand. What does it mean when it talks about a woman who for 18 years had been tormented or held captive to an evil spirit by which she was bent in two? Now what we do know is that in many of these cultures, as most cultures today, there is an interest and an involvement, and very often at the ritualistic level, in what is referred to as the occult, or witchcraft, or summoning spirits, or functioning outside of the realm of the, if you like, the here and now world. What we also know is that children have very often been used in these rituals in very evil ways, and that there is such a thing as the power of Satan, the power of evil spirits. This really doesn't give us a lot to work with here, but what we do know is that this woman somehow had become wrapped up in some involvement, either herself or as a child, the victim of others, which is very often the case. And it was very often the case that Jesus, when he encountered evil spirits, he was liberating people who had become victims of these evil spirits, as it were.